Thanks, Paul, and sorry to keep passing the baton here, but Glenn, our fearless leader, has graced us with his presence. So I thought I'd kick it to Glenn in case he wants to give us some inspiring words to start with.
Thanks for that, Mike. Well, hi, everybody, and I appreciate you getting this call together. Obviously, the relationship between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our sport fishing industry is incredibly important. And so the more communication, the better, in trying to understand exactly what we're going to be doing here with Sportfish Restoration Boating Trust Fund and state appropriations, et cetera. So again, I appreciate the time and look forward to hearing more about what you have to share with us.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And yeah, we'll just echo that. Appreciate service working with us to set this up. This was a meeting that really was prompted after several discussions we've been having, government affairs committee meetings and sort of side conversations I've been a part of, where ASA's message all along is that we, as an industry, are strongly supportive of the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund, despite it being a pretty significant sacrifice in a lot of cases. The amount of excise taxes paid are higher than a lot of companies' profit margins. That this is a valuable investment for the industry because we know that it's going to create more and better fishing opportunities. And I know that by and large the industry truly does believe in that. But there's also a lot of vague uncertainty about how all this works. Manufacturers write the check, off it goes to IRS, and we sort of hear bits and pieces here and there about how the money's used. And I think the more understanding, awareness there is of everything that goes on in between, you cutting that quarterly check to the boat ramp getting built, the habitat restoration project getting done, hatchery operations. I think that's just good for industry to know because it's a really successful story. And I think it'll also help, as we as an industry want to ensure we're getting, a strong bang for our buck, that those dollars are being used wisely. Just, the more transparency, understanding, awareness, can maybe help some communication and maybe conversations that might be needed with certain agencies where, whether it's real or perception, that maybe we don't know that the money's being used to the highest and best use. So I think service understanding or explaining its role, all the checks and balances, the amount of administration that goes into this should be really useful, and we'll probably have varying degrees of understanding amongst the participants here, folks who know it inside and out and others who might be hearing it for the first time. So thanks again, Paul, you and team, and then thanks to all of our members that have joined us here. Looks like we've got a pretty good cross-representation of government affairs committee members, board members, manufacturers, retailers, media. This is not for reporting, by the way, the handful of you media folks. I think this will be a great conversation. Only thing else I wanted to mention up front, just because it's really top of mind for us at ASA, is we're working hard on the excise tax slippage issue that we've talked about for a long time, of addressing the challenge of foreign manufactured products being sold direct to U.S. consumers and through e-commerce sites, and no excise tax likely getting paid on those. We were very excited to see the GAO report come out a couple of weeks ago and have been hard at work. We actually had a round of meetings last week, myself and the head of the Archery Trade Association's government affairs team, to raise awareness, and are excited that we seem to be getting a lot of positive reception from Congress on addressing that, which we believe will not only create more fair and level playing field, but ultimately result in more revenue being brought into this program, which ultimately is good news for conservation. So we'll be hard at work at that. But in the meantime, Paul, I think that's all I've got. So I'll kick it back to you, and thanks for everybody for being here.
And thanks, Mike, and welcome everybody. I want to start off by thanking all of our industry folks that are here today for the huge contribution you make to conservation and recreation across the country. It's not a day goes by that I think collectively as a group we don't think about that and talk about it in some form or fashion. So thank you for that. As Matt mentioned at the beginning, my name is Paul Roush. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Conservation Investment, formerly known as Wildlife and Sportfish Restoration Program. And that program obviously still exists. We've just expanded some responsibilities, so we have a different organizational name now. But our primary responsibility, as laid out in the Improvement Act, is to administer, manage, and oversee the use of these funds, both on the wildlife restoration side and the sportfish and boating side. And so we take that very seriously. And Ryan Oster, on our head of our training team, is going to lead you through a PowerPoint along with some assistance from additional staff that will really lay out how this process works at a fairly high level, how the taxes are collected, how they're distributed to states, what states need to do to be able to participate in the program, what uses are eligible under the Act, what oversight we provide in terms of auditing and making sure the funds are used how they're supposed to be used, and then finally a little bit of information on how we are collecting and reporting and making available the great work that gets done in this program, and all of the great accomplishments that happen each year. So I'll turn it over to Ryan to get us started here. So thank you.
Ryan?
Matt, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you now.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. And if you could let me know if you are seeing that.
Yes, we got it.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar for us to give you a very brief overview of the Sportfish Restoration Program. As many of you may know or may not, the Sportfish Restoration Act, it was originally passed way back in 1950. Some of us, myself included, we often refer to it as the Dingell-Johnson Act. And while this act, it's been amended several times over the course of the years, arguably perhaps its most significant amendment took place in 1984, collectively known as the Wallet-Brough Amendment. And that was the amendment which expanded the excise tax base to include revenue from that portion of the federal fuels tax that is attributable to motorboat use and small engine usage. Today, Sportfish Restoration Program, it continues to stand out as one of the nation's most important conservation programs. I'm proud to say that because I've experienced it firsthand, the power and impact of this program. During my previous working days, I used to work directly for a state fish and wildlife agency implementing these sportfish restoration dollars. This program, it is without question a model for how successful partnerships between manufacturers, our state fish and wildlife agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and let's not also forget our anglers and boaters, how collectively that partnership accomplishes sportfish conservation past, present, and into the future. Funding for this program comes from a broad, wide-ranging excise tax base, and those are paid by manufacturers, producers, and importers, which are ultimately then deposited into the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund. I'll just call it the trust fund from here on out. Let's talk about what some of those funding mechanisms are. There's a 3% excise tax on the sale of electric motors. Fishing equipment and fishing tackle is taxed at a rate of about 10% with a few exceptions. A couple of those exceptions being that tackle boxes are only taxed at 3%. And the maximum tax on a fishing rod or pole is capped at no more than $10 per item. Additionally, fishing lines in excess of 130 pounds test are not taxed. Additionally, there's import duties that are collected on a variety of boat types, as well as import duties on fishing equipment and tackle. These duty amounts vary from as low as 1% and can range as high as up to 9.2% based on the import duty item. Arguably, the largest funding stream that goes into the trust fund comes from that portion of the federal fuel tax that is attributable to both motorboat and small engine fuel usage. These amounts are determined by formulas and are not determined by fuel sold at, say, marinas that many people often think. Lastly, income comes from interest that is earned on these revenues once they are deposited into the trust fund. Here we got a graph that's showing you the total amount of money annually from the Sportfish Restoration and Boating Trust Fund. You can see from this figure over the last 10 years, I look at the funding as relatively consistent, ranging from anywhere from $625 million in 1 year, as much as up to $742 million in 1 year. As you can see, we saw pretty sizable increases in the trust fund during those unfortunate COVID years, which also coincided with state fish and wildlife agencies and other data sources concurring with increased interest, participation, and expenditures related to fishing during those COVID years. Generally, we don't see a lot of dramatic swings in funding in the trust fund from year to year, at least over the last 10 years anyway. Here's another way to see that same data, but this is a 10-year history of the trust fund, but it's now articulating the amount of funding in the trust fund based on those various excise tax groups I just talked to you about. As you can see, the largest percentage of the trust fund annually comes from that revenue attributable from motorboat fuel tax, small engine federal fuel tax, and fishing equipment. Those are the big three items that really fuel the trust fund. While all the excise tax groups are important, we generally see that historically revenue from those electric motors, fishing rods and poles, fishing tackle boxes, and interest make up a much smaller and lesser percentage of the overall trust fund balance in any given year. I really like this graph. This graph shows the percentage of the total that each of those tax groups contributes to the trust fund over the last 10 years on an annual basis. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the majority of that revenue contributing to the trust fund does indeed come from motorboat fuel and small engine federal fuel taxes. Over the last 10 years, those two sources alone, motorboat and small engine, those two sources have averaged contributing up to almost 66% of the total revenue that goes into the trust fund. Those are the power funding sources. This graph also, you might notice, is displaying a slight, albeit slight, decreasing amount of motorboat fuel in the trust fund over the last 10 years. However, despite this slight decrease, we still see that the federal fuel tax attributable to motorboat usage continues to be the largest contributor towards the fund, and over the last 10 years has, at least at one time or another, been over 50% of the trust fund in and of itself. Small engine federal fuel tax is relatively stable over the last 10 years. We don't see a lot of changes from year to year, and we also don't see a lot of changes from the contributions of fishing equipment, rods, and tackle boxes. Let's jump back to how this money gets distributed. So once these revenues are deposited into the trust fund, they're then distributed out the following federal fiscal year. As required by the Sportfish Restoration Act, there's a series of initial deductions from the trust fund. Let's go over those deductions and we'll go on a clockwise fashion. So first we see that $200,000 comes out of the trust fund, and each of the 4 fisheries commissions consisting of the Atlantic, the Gulf, the Pacific, and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, they each get $200,000 directly out of the trust fund. Next, $400,000 is provided to the Sport Fishing and Boating Partnership Council. Administrative funding is provided to the Coast Guard for them to administer the state recreational boating safety programs. And then similarly and lastly, the Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Conservation Investment, we also receive administrative funding to implement and administer the Sportfish Restoration Program to our state fish and wildlife agencies. Both Fish and Wildlife Service and Coast Guard administrative funding, those amounts are set at mandated amounts and are adjusted annually based on the Consumer Price Index. After those initial deductions occur, then the remaining balance of the trust fund gets distributed accordingly. A little over 18.5% goes to the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act. 17.315% goes to the Coast Guard for them to administer out those state recreational boating safety programs. 4% of the balance gets shared between 2 grant programs that Office of Conservation Investment administers, and that is the Boating Infrastructure Grant Program and the Clean Vessel Act Grant Program. And then an additional 2% is also made available for funding the National Outreach and Communication Program. Once we issue that, that leaves a remaining balance left over in the trust fund of about a little over 58%, 58.012% of the trust fund. That money, we then deduct $3 million, and that is earmarked to be used for the traditional multi-state conservation program. Once we subtract that $3 million, the remaining balance is what ultimately gets provided back out as annual apportionments to the various state and territory fish and wildlife agencies for them to use under the Sportfish Restoration Program. When we provide those annual sportfish restoration apportionments to the state, we provide it based on mandatory formulas that are established in the Sportfish Restoration Act. That mandatory formula is a two-part formula. The first part, 40% of the apportionment, is based on a state's land and water area compared to the total of all states' land and water area. And then the other part of that formula is 60% is based on the number of certified paid fishing licenses sold in a state compared to the total number of certified paid fishing license sold in all states. That's how it gets determined how much money goes to each state and ultimately to state fish and wildlife agencies. The Act mandates that no state shall receive more than 5% of this total amount of money that's available, and no state shall receive less than 1%. We do have some states that are maximum states. They get the 5%. We have states that receive minimum. The Act also mandates that Puerto Rico shall automatically receive 1%, irrespective of their license and land and water area. And the Act also mandates that the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the District of Columbia, they each receive 1/3 of 1%. And it, again, that is irrespective of how many licenses they sell or how big land and water area they possess. Our Partner with a Payer website highlights the accomplishments of both the wildlife and sportfish restoration funded programs. And again, these accomplishments can't happen without the successful partnership between manufacturers who pay these federal excise taxes, our state agency partners who implement the conservation, and the Fish and Wildlife Service who help to effectively minister these programs. On this website, we also house information pertaining to these state apportionment fundings that come from the Sportfish Restoration Program. If you're interested in finding out more information about these annual apportionments, you can scan this QR code, or you can click on funding sources on this Partner with a Payer webpage. Once you get to that funding source, you'll find a variety of resources as well as general information about the Sportfish Restoration Program. We update these apportionments annually, and since 1939, a total of over $28.6 billion in federal funding has been provided to states and territories through both the wildlife and sportfish restoration programs. Of this amount, Sportfish has contributed 11.8 billion as of 2024. Looking into the apportionment data, when you scroll down to the middle of the page, you'll find it. And on display here, we see the most current federal fiscal year apportionment that was provided to our states and territorial partners. You again see mentioned that since 1952, Sportfish has provided 11.8 billion. And we also do an adjustment where we adjust all those years' funding into current 2023 dollars. And when you do that, the inflation adjusted amount of this program has contributed over $18.5 billion in funding. Let's look a little bit more into the apportionment data. If you click on View Apportionment Data, if you want to get into it and play around with it, here's where you can do so. Once you're in the data, there's several options for viewing and modifying the apportionment data. This particular option here allows you to view Sportfish annual apportionments dating all the way back since inception. The first apportionment was issued in 1952. And you can also filter the data to view each individual state or territory's total SFR apportionment since the inception of the program. Additionally, you can look at data in graphical fashion where you can view each individual state or territory's SFR apportionment through time. This view can also be modified to show those total apportionments both each year and adjusted to that 2023 dollar value. I would like to draw attention to on this slide, this happens to be Texas here. You'll notice that big monumental increase in SFR funding starting in around 1986. You may remember that was that passage of that Wallet-Bro Amendment that brought in motorboat and small engine federal fuel tax into the trust fund. That was the first jumpstart we saw in this program. Next, data can also be viewed in a tabular fashion to display each state or territory's annual apportionment throughout time. And again, you can also bring in that's inflation adjusted to the 2023 dollar value worth. All right, let's navigate away from apportionments a little bit and let's talk about how do you become eligible to receive these funds. The only eligible recipients of Sportfish restoration funding are states, and particularly states participating through their respective fish and wildlife agencies, and they got to pass 3 eligibility requirements before they can participate in this program. First requirement is they've got to pass a law that basically assents or agrees to comply with the provisions of the Sportfish Act. Second, the state has to pass additional laws for conservation of fish in the state. Easily all states meet that one. And then arguably the most important requirement is that the state must also pass a law which shall prohibit against the diversion of those license fees paid by fishers in their state for any other purpose than said administration of that state fish and wildlife agency. It's that last eligibility requirement that has arguably been the bedrock cornerstone to the success and long-term health of state fish and wildlife agencies and this Sportfish restoration program. Should a state potentially divert license revenue beyond the administration of their agency, then the state risks being placed in what is called diversion. If declared in diversion, the state becomes ineligible to receive new apportionments until that diversion is resolved and license revenue is returned back to the state fish and wildlife agency. Let's talk a little bit about what SFR funding can be used for. I'm sure you're all very interested in this. And it's really pretty wide open. SFR funding can be used to fund a wide range of activities around the betterment of sport fish. Now, this term sport fish, it means aquatic, gill-breathing vertebrate animals that have paired fins, and though they must have material value for sport or recreation in either the marine or the fresh waters of the United States. States ultimately determine what their priorities are for how they want to spend their sport fish apportionment. The Fish and Wildlife Service does not determine what a state's priorities are. Once a state determines how they want to use their sport fish restoration funds, they then submit a grant application to their respective Office of Conservation Investment regional office, and their staff review the application for eligibility in the program, what we call substantiality in character and design, and we also have to review it to meet federal environmental compliances. Let's talk about what these activities are. Arguably the most common activity that the public sees state fish and wildlife agencies most often using SFR funding for is for those broad survey, monitoring, and research efforts aimed at establishing, developing, conserving, enhancing their various sport fish species and communities throughout the state. These activities are on full display when you see agency staff standing in the front of that electrofishing boat with those dip nets pulling in fish. It's also on display when they're using trap nets, seines, gill nets, a variety of other equipment. These funded efforts allow fisheries biologists to collect a wealth of data that helps them determine various biological factors, abundance, growth, mortality, recruitment of fish species, everything they need to effectively manage these populations. We also can collect fish health data through information obtained from blood, organ, tissue samples. We also have the ability to determine fish age through the collection and examination of scales, otolith, which are basically ear bones. You can also age fish using spines and vertebrae, depending on the particular species of interest. Lastly, fish harvest data. It's also often collected using creel surveys, tagging fish, tracking fish, soliciting anglers to provide information about fish they caught. Ultimately, over 200 species of fish are annually monitored, researched, and managed using SFR funding. That's an impressive amount of species that benefit from this funding. State Fish and Wildlife agencies, they also use SFR funding to operate their fish hatcheries, where staff spawn, fertilize, hatch, and stock a variety of cold, cool, warm water fish species. These hatcheries, they're expensive to operate, but the cost is well worth it. There are many sport fisheries in the U.S. that are maintained solely through the production and stocking of hatchery-reared fish. And without these hatcheries and the qualified staff to operate them, many of these fisheries might only be a fraction of what they are today. In 2021, Sportfish restoration funding was used to operate over 300 state fish hatcheries that produced more than 1 billion fish, comprised of 75 different sport fish species. That is just an impressive number. 1 billion fish comprised of 75 different species. I still get goosebumps thinking about that number. Perhaps less known, state fish and wildlife agencies also use SFR funding to acquire real property interests to help protect fish habitat and improve degraded habitats. They also acquire real property to provide public fishing access for those without boats. State agencies also acquire land to construct, operate, and maintain public boating access sites. These access sites, they don't just benefit recreational anglers, but they also benefit recreational boaters, canoers, and kayakers. State Fish and Wildlife agencies also use SFR funding to maintain and enhance habitat and structure that benefit sport fish species and anglers. This is especially evident in certain parts of the U.S. where man-made reservoirs in particular are aging and habitat is starting to become limiting. Funding can also be used to manage invasive species that also threaten our species and habitats. In some cases, state fish and wildlife agencies have successfully used sport fish restoration funding to actually construct new lakes and reservoirs where they never existed. Once constructed, these areas need to be maintained to ensure the public has access, and sport fish funding is often used for that maintenance as well. In 2021, over 8,900 areas were operated and maintained for the public boating and fishing access, 8,900 areas. And in the last 6 years alone, state fish and wildlife agencies have used sport fish restoration funding to construct 320 new boating access sites. Also, perhaps lesser known, what the state fish and wildlife agencies use the sport fish restoration funding for is for educational and R3 recruitment, retention, and reactivation programs. These programs are not only designed to educate the public about fishing and boating opportunities, but also to inspire new participants to give fishing a try and retain them once they're hooked. A wide variety of activities can be funded as long as those activities provide education to broadly increase the public's awareness of water resources, their awareness of aquatic life, sport fishing, and in general, how to be responsible, safe, ethical anglers. Since 2018, over 850,000 students have received training in aquatic education, and all of this has happened because of sport fish restoration funding. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Scott Knight, who is going to briefly talk about how the Fish and Wildlife Service oversees the sport fish restoration program and how both the Fish and Wildlife Service and state agencies help to protect its integrity. Scott?
Thank you, Ron, and good day, everyone. I do have the opportunity to talk to you about how we provide some of the program stewardship, well, actually us and the states. Ryan, can you go ahead and turn the slide there? Okay, here we go. So Ryan spoke to you about the assent legislation and all the requirements, and I'm going to focus in on the requirement that he last spoke of, which was that the hunting and fishing license fees of the state must be dedicated solely to the administration of the state's Fish and Wildlife Agency. This is our number one management priority when it comes to our compliance actions we take. If there is an issue out there related to assent legislation, it immediately goes to the top of our stack. Now, you might be thinking, well, why would the state divert their state hunting and fishing license fees, a state fish and wildlife agency? Well, it's oftentimes, and most times, not the state fish and wildlife agencies that are taking these actions. It could be tied to legislative action. It could be tied to initiatives of the administration. And sometimes it's even inadvertent. They're doing broad sweeping legislation and they don't even realize that they are putting their sport fish funding and wildlife restoration funding in jeopardy. So we work very cooperatively with the states to address those. I've worked in the program for 30 years and I think it goes on beyond that. We have never not prevailed on one of these assent legislation issues. So I think we're all very proud of that, that we can ensure that not only the license revenue, but any facility or real property or any other asset acquired with this funding must remain within the control of the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. And there's even one other bonus. Any income generated from that, all those sources of revenue is also protected. So it ensures that the match is not only there for sport fish and wildlife restoration, but also other conservation actions that may not be funded through these programs. So it is, I always say, it was a stroke of brilliance. Whoever wrote that into the initial law really had some vision. Another thing we do is we do audits. So we have 66 entities that receive sport fish funding. Each entity is audited at least once every 6 years by the Department of the Interior's Office of Inspector General. This is actually a contract that we initiate with the OIG because we believe that's a core to having accountability in a program is to have a strong audit component. In fact, I was talking to a state yesterday that's working through some audit issues, and their comment, one of the last things they told me was, wow, these audits can be a pain, but they're so great for the program. And I was really relieved to hear this person who was struggling trying to work through some of these audit issues still believe that this is the right thing to do to have these audits. Next slide, Ron. Okay, we have the hammer and the very strict oversight of audits, but one of the things we try to do is be proactive, and we have a training program. It's not very big. It's only 3 people. Ryan leads that team very capably, but they accomplish a lot. We have an opportunity to get people on site or in a virtual format like this and start building not only their knowledge about what it takes to manage these funds from Sportfish Restoration Trust Fund, but also all the other federal requirements that come along with managing grants. So Ryan and his team over the past 2 years have conducted 42 training events and reached over 1,700 state staff. So a lot of people out there that are daily engaged in working with this funding, they have been trained and they understand the requirements and the obligations they have. And then another area that we think is just as important, it's ensuring that we have strong coordination and communication with the states. Oftentimes that might start with Ron and his team and training, but there's a lot of engagements. We have regional annual meetings that the states and the region host. We have quarterly coordination calls with the leadership of the state federated coordinators and conservation investment leadership. And then we at a very high level, we have the joint policy task force made up of state leadership and conservation investment leadership, where we meet to talk through those very complicated policy issues and try to come to an agreement on how to move forward operationally. Next slide, Ron. All right, so one of the things that we use some metrics to determine how well are we doing with the stewardship of the program. So let's look at the audits, right? So we pulled some data from 2017 because it's the best data we had available, but it showed that only 1% of the total cost spent in wildlife and sport fish restoration programs was questioned by the Office of Inspector General. And this was out of $768 million. Whereas if you looked at the rest of the audits the Office of Inspector General conducted, or not on these programs, but on other programs, on average, 15% of costs were questioned. So we feel like this is demonstrating results not only of the audit program, but also the training program and the communication and coordination we do with the states. And we feel like the states have very high capacity to successfully manage these funds. Next slide, Rod. So, that's kind of like our assessments of how the audits have worked. We did have, we're 50, on average, the average state report had $59.7 million of cost reviewed during the audit. Only on average 147,000 approximately are questioned, which is only ends up with less than 0.5% or 4.41% of question costs. And I even have to put an asterisk on that, right? That's just what the IG has questioned. Oftentimes we come back and that was a lack of supporting documentation. We're able subsequently after the audit to secure that documentation and uphold those challenged costs. However, if the state cannot overcome those documentation challenges, we will require them to pay back in every year. There are some cases where we require states to pay back. So that's a little bit about our program stewardship and accountability. I'm going to pass it over to Nick Popoff, and he's going to talk to you about some additional information.
All right, thanks, Ryan and Scott. Talk about available information. The first thing I want to talk about is TRACS. TRACS is our grant reporting tool. It's been a long time coming, and it was implemented in 2021. So it was a big lift for Fish and Wildlife Service and our states because grants really had to be completely restructured to fit the tool. So there's standard objectives, there's activities, there's units of measures to report by. So it was a big lift. So while it went active in 2021, we're just at a point right now where we're starting to get data in the system. And so in the next few weeks, we're going to be releasing the TRACS accomplishment reporting tool to our TRACS users. So that will allow federal and state users that are TRACS users to go in and use TRACS and aggregate the data, which has been the goal of this system all along. So we're really excited about that. And so I want to circle back to partner with a pair now, because most of you on this call are not TRACS users who won't be able to go in the system. So we're going to drive these data and the results to the partner with a pair website. So Ryan a few minutes ago talked about that funding source area, and I want to point to two other areas as we talk about where data are. The first is the resources. The second is a newer area that we're just adding to partner with pair, which is called grant happenings, which is where we're going to funnel our TRACS information. So Ryan, next slide. So for the resources section, this is a great area to get. We use this all the time when we go out to say ICAST or wherever. There's lots of one-pagers that have great information and all the accomplishments that have been done. There are also big reports like the national survey and the taxed items. So this is a great space to go to get information depending on your audience. We share this all the time. I'm going to be going to the state organization of voting organization, state organization of voting authority next in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to take a bunch of these materials with me. Next slide, Ryan. Second area is our new spot on Partner with a Pair, and it's called the Grant Happenings area. So this is where we're going to bucket information. It's where we're going to have summary information from TRACS, and this is where we can communicate with ASA and user groups to help incorporate and cater to different reports that are of interest. So depending on your needs and desires. So we're going to be bucketing these by habitat, species, and access and facilities. But within those areas, in the next 6 months or so, we're going to be having more detailed reports. And as we prepared for this and we were talking to Mike, he said something, and so he talked about peeking behind the curtain a little bit. So we're not going to dive into TRACS, but I wanted to do that a little bit with you and show how we're going to be organizing these data. Next slide, Ryan. Oh, This is the new, go to the next slide. Sorry, I just talked about that one. So we're going to be bucketing these in two different areas. So the first will be featured accomplishment reports, which are going to be sort of this history of what we've heard of interest. So facilities constructed, operated, and maintained. And so where are they located? Stock species, that's of interest. That's one of the biggest ones we hear. Where are fish stocked, whether it be by state, region, nationally. Education, so how many students were trained annually or over the course of several years. Real property, where was property purchased, etc. And then managed acres. This is an area that I think we're very interested in communicating more about, because these are just some examples of how we're going to summarize this information, but we're really interested in other areas that you may have interest in. So outside of these buckets. Next slide, Ryan. This gets into more of our matrix of how TRACS is built. So we're calling this the Program Accomplishment Reports by Strategy. And so this is the nuts and bolts of TRACS, and really getting into the depth of it and the restructuring of grants and how they are structured. So, and these are 7 areas that we're focused on right now, which is direct habitat species management. So getting into, restoration, maintenance of habitat, biological processes, et cetera. More into facilities and renovation, acquisition by program year, incentives. So where incentives are used in grants to deliver economic incentive, et cetera, for private landowners. The big one is research, survey, data collection, and analysis. So this is really the catch-all. Ryan spoke about this heavily in his eligible activities, but where dollars are spent to go investigate fisheries, wildlife, et cetera. Species stocking is another big one. I just spoke about that in the feature. This is the broader view of that. And then finally, training and education. So, a big portion of our dollars are spent in that arena. So trying to summarize where and how education and training occurs. And that's all I have for my slides with data. I think the key message for us is, the communication, the partnership, and having these conversations so we can build upon these examples. So I just provided 14 examples across 2 different areas. I think what we're interested in as we're in this critical period of reporting out is really having these conversations and building these out, making sure the Grant Happenings website is active and actively used by our partners, and to have better knowledge of where these accomplishments are and how great they are. So with that, I'll pause, and I'm not sure if we're doing questions now or moving over to.
Yeah.
Well, hand it back to you, Matt.
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. And team, Allie from AFWA, I wanted to give you a couple minutes. We'll leave about 10 minutes here for Q&A after Allie gets done. Thank you, Allie.
I'll be quick. So hi, everyone. My name is Allie Schwab, and I'm the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Policy Program Manager with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, also known as AFWA for short. So just for those of you who might be unfamiliar or less familiar with our organization, AFWA is the association that represents the state and territorial fisheries and wildlife agencies before Congress with the administration. So as you all know, states have primary authority over fish and wildlife public trust resources within their borders, and it's our role to advocate for state agencies' rights and abilities to manage those natural resources. So through our committee structure, and we have biannual in-person meetings, AFWA provides a forum for states to come together and to discuss and, where appropriate, address issues collectively. As you can imagine, among the 50 states, there's quite a lot of variation in both the resource challenges they have and what they prioritize. And obviously, this is heavily influenced by the characteristics of the natural environment in their state and the values and priorities of the state's constituents. But our position is that as the ones closest to the natural resources and the people they serve, the states are best placed to determine how to allocate those resources within the bounds set by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So maintaining that flexibility and independent decision-making for states and how they allocate their sportfish funds is very important to us. And having recently seen the latest trends in fishing participation, I think it's clear to say that it works. The state's work to provide better fishing opportunities is attracting more anglers, especially from those underrepresented groups. And I should note that we have a really good relationship with ASA. As a contributing member of AFWA, ASA has that line of communication with the state agencies. We often have Mike sit in on some of our meetings, and it's a great opportunity to keep those lines of communication open and hear from ASA what is a priority for your membership. So a recent discussion we had on responses to advances in fishing technology, most importantly, forward-facing sonar, was instigated by Mike's request made to the Fisheries and Water Resources Policy Committee. And then likewise, AFWA's attendance at ASA's policy meetings, ICAST, and Sportfish summits help us to understand the perspectives and concerns of those paying into the fund as we work on things like reauthorization. So I will stop there to make sure we have 10 minutes for questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Allie. Truly appreciate that. Team, let's shift into the Q&A session. I realize we've got about 10 minutes. I wanted to give our executive leadership from ASA and Fish and Wildlife Service a chance to close us out as well. Mike, I would like to make an offer to ASA and the members here. If we do run out of time, we're happy to take submitted questions. If people want to, run things up to you, written or otherwise, we're happy to respond to those. I know there was a lot of information here today. So, but with that, we do have some live time here. Folks, if you don't mind using that raise hand function, again, it should be at the top of your toolbar, at the top of your screen. So if you hit that, we're happy to do our best to answer questions. Mr. Gill, I think, and then let's see, Doug and Mike, and then Glenn. Go ahead.
I'll be real quick. Thank you for your time. I'm an ASA board member. My name is Patrick Gill from Tackle Direct. We're a retailer. Are you starting to think in the future about the electrification of boats and how that could affect the income to the fund out 10, 20 years or so if less motorboat fuel and small boat engine fuel is contributing to the fund?
Yeah, I'll shoot that one out to Nick Popoff from our programs group.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this is the second time we've gotten this question in the past couple of weeks, and so this one is related to just the taxable items. And so right now it's not something that is taxable. Oh wait, it is taxable. So
yeah.
Wait, I want to pause here. Ryan and I went back and forth here because Ryan,
electric motors are currently taxed, but I think
Yes.
Patrick's question is more if we transition more to electric and away from gasoline powered engines, what does that mean to this program?
Right.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we're thinking about it and talking about it. I mean, I have not seen a projection on what might that be, 15 years out. I think, obviously the technology needs to change a little bit too, to get more power behind that. But it is happening, and it's something we're receiving a little bit of funding from. But in terms of the gas tax, it's still strong and it's still driving it. So I'll pause there and see if anyone else on the team has other comments on that. This is something we're just talking about.
Yeah, Nick, I'll just jump in real quick for 1 second. Yeah, I mean, obviously the way that the taxes are collected are part of the various laws that govern that. And so if there is a massive shift to electric boat motors over time, that's obviously going to have a big impact on the trust fund. And, us as a federal agency, we don't, lobby legislation or anything like that. So, the industry, ASA and others would likely, take the mantle on pushing forward some sort of change to replace those funds. And then we would be, background technical advisors to that where appropriate. But yeah, clearly it's a concern. 20 years down the road, who knows? And so that's something that we all need to keep our eye on, I think.
Mike, just something we got to have on the radar for the future.
Oh yeah, well, Patrick, yeah, just to jump in, we've definitely talked about it a lot within kind of the NGO community. I've actually mentioned it several times up on the Hill, just to make sure folks up there are aware. We don't necessarily have a solution. A lot of those decisions are going to be above our pay grade as to how we, better capture revenue to help pay for service transportation infrastructure and maintenance and everything else. Our message has been, we're a part of this. So however that shakes out, make sure at least we are at least held harmless. But we've also had discussions, AFWA and CSF and all the other groups that advocate for this program about engaging in some longer term kind of strategic planning of what does the future of this fund look like, this being a component of it, but just in general, this has it's been a really successful model for 70 plus years, but we don't want to get caught flat-footed or be stale. So is it worth some sort of independent kind of wholesale examination of, are we missing revenue streams that can and should go into this? Are there other purposes? It's just sort of a healthy time to take a fresh look at where are we now, what changes might be coming in the future, and how do we make sure that we're maximizing our investments here?
I'm not an expert on this at all, but I heard in states like California, there's been so much electric vehicles in California that the income that they had generated has fallen dramatically because of the electrical car use. So it's changed the shift. And so that's just one little example of what could happen maybe long time down the road, but you're on it. And that I just wanted to make sure we were talking about it, and you guys are. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Great question. Doug, Mike, Glenn, and then John. Got about 5 minutes. Go ahead, Doug.
So thank you, and I appreciate this webinar. I think this is awesome. It really gives us some really good insight. I work for Akuma Fishing Tackle. We are a manufacturer of rods and reels. I'm also I'm president of CCA California and on some of the government affairs boards for ASA. I am from California, and I appreciate a lot of the things that you have all spoken about. I think Mike touched on some issues earlier regarding some of the transparencies and priorities of how the dollars are spent. And I would say in some of our meetings at the ASA level, I've been approached by various state fish and game, and they've welcomed the interaction with recreational fishing people to be able to talk about priorities. Unfortunately, in California, quite frankly, we don't feel that there's that transparency. And we would encourage to find ways for states to work better with recognized recreational fishing groups to try to see how we can better prioritize what we feel is better prioritized. And I'll just give you one example, and I'll close, is the white sea bass hatchery. Funding has been cut over the years. We've asked about some of the other priorities, and specifically to, the 15% that's of the funding that's dedicated to aqua resource education. How is that money spent? And the response was, we're allowed to spend 15%. Thank you. But the white sea bass hatchery has made some really strong gains for recreational angling and just absolute conservation. It is a success, but the funding's been cut. And so how do we help prioritize those types of projects? We realize there needs to be flexibility. We realize the states have to have the ultimate authority, but being able to participate at that level, I think there should be some ways that we could work closer together. And again, thank you. This is much appreciated.
You're welcome, Doug. Great great question, and we'll continue to discuss that. Glenn and then John.
Okay, thanks. I know time is really short. I do appreciate this meeting, and Ryan, I think you did a great job of explaining. I've gotten pretty close to SFR over the last decade, and you nailed it. So we appreciate that explanation. I think it's important to know also that the outreach comes, that 2% has been dedicated or funding Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, RBFF, for the last 25 years. I think your team's done a great job on partnering with the payer, and the videos show it, and look forward to getting together with many of you in Arkansas next month. Tracks, as Paul knows, it's been a long time coming, but it's also come a long way. So I appreciate that you guys have stuck to it, and it's really almost there. And I'm going to come back real quick on electric motors. I think, again, 12 million boats are out there. That's in the formula, how that is determined. That 66% for motorboat fuel tax is nice. The transformation to electric is going to take a lot longer when there's only 200 to 300,000 new boats created each year, and the average boat's 25 years old. The transition to electric motors is going to be slow. So with that, I'll move on.
Thank you, Glenn. John, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is John. I work for Viking Yacht Company. We also have an in-house sales department too, where we sell not only our own brands but other brands of boats as well. And I also had a question about the electric motor taxation. I thought it was interesting seeing that revenue sort of flatline. And I guess my question is, are electric motors only taxed when they are the primary propulsion source, or are you also taxing supplemental motors where like a electric motor can be used for a trolling motor? And I just from our experience, that's an area of significant growth in terms of having a trolling motor, at least on the saltwater boats that we sell. So it was sort of surprising to see that revenue sort of flatline there.
It's all trolling motors right now.
Yeah, does that, Paul, anybody else expand on that?
The tax is 3% on the sale of the electric motor. It's not specific that it has to be attached to the vessel. John, I don't know, is that answering your question?
So it's taxed regardless if it's used as the primary propulsion source or if it's an accessory like a trolling motor, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
All right, team. I don't see any other hands. Please take that opportunity. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, since it sounds like maybe we got a little bit of time here, but this will be quick. Scott, I wanted to jump back to something you had in your slides, the stat of the number of projects that the IG's office questioned or asked about was really, really low. I'm not sure how exactly to word this, but this seems like a program in which to truly understand how the money is being spent, you'd have to have a fairly strong grasp of natural resource management and fisheries management. So I wonder, are the folks that were reviewing this, how well do they understand? Because I can imagine a state fish and wildlife agency that understands what they're doing a whole lot better than, someone who's just reviewing a bunch of forms could maybe confuse people into thinking that this is a legitimate use when someone with a better understanding of natural resource management might disagree. So I guess how much training and how much sort of checks and balances are there to ensure that, this is truly going at it, just given how complicated and wonky, fisheries management can be?
That's a great question, Mike. I'm going to speak in general because, any resourcing of, staff is going to be all over the map. But what tends to happen with the IG auditors is a couple things. One, they stick around auditing this program for quite a while. We just had some retire after like 20 years of being involved in the audits. Ryan's team leads a training effort, so they get trained by our trainers specific to the program. And we also have an annual workshop that we do with the IG. Our financial and administrative folks go off to a place and we meet with the IG and we work through these issues. So I think their awareness is pretty good. considering that most of them are coming from a accounting finance background, but they know a lot about the program, and it kind of shows up in the results. They can get very specific into eligibility or allowability issues.
Okay, thanks. This isn't just sort of transitory people passing through periodically looking at this stuff. There's more institutional knowledge than that. Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
All right, team, please take us up on that offer. Submit questions to Mike. Mike, if you're okay being that touch point, that consolidate those questions, we're happy to answer those. We'll turn those around as quickly as we can. We have an active dialogue on many things already. Very respectfully wanted to give it the closeout to AD Roush and ASA. So Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time. And as Matt offered, we'll continue to be a resource as needed to answer any questions or support in other ways as well. I just want to, thank the team for putting together the presentation and ASA for the invite. I think to the extent this is helpful and, this is something you want to do at another time in another format or however, just let us know. We think this is one of the most important parts of our job is informing people on how this program works and it pays dividends down the road. So with that, I'll turn it over to Glenn or Mike to close us out.
And I'll say thanks again also, and thanks also to the sport fishing industry that's not only on the call, but throughout our world of fishing, because they are funding a large portion of this. And I appreciate what they do every day.
Yeah, and not to throw too many, pleasantries here at everybody, but I'd just echo that. And I'm not blowing smoke here, but truly the relationship we have with Paul and his team is outstanding. I think the evidence here of, the team you've brought here, Paul, the amount of prep work, research you all put into this, clearly you all care. You view the industry relationship as really, really important. The partner with a payer program's great evidence of you all going above and beyond to make sure that not just the industry and the partners involved, but kind of the broader community understands the value of this program, the work that's being done across the board. So it's a great relationship. Every time I have a question or fielding a question from someone, Paul, you and your team are always extremely responsive, really, really helpful, open dialogue. So it's a great relationship, probably amongst the federal agencies, maybe the best one I can think of we have with any office. So credit to you all and the great work you all have done. And I'm sure we'll be getting more questions and have more room for discussion in the future. And I'm confident you all will be there to help us along the way. So thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great
Thanks,
day.
everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Have a great day.